Good morning. Good morning. Chairman Jennick, you know I've practiced your name, and I'm a New Yorker, so I had this down pat even the first time I saw it. But I guess my nerves are getting the best of me. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll get it right when I introduce you. Commissioners Clyburn, Rosen-Morcel, and Commissioner Pai, and all of you who have come here today for this important hearing. My name is Denise L. Pease. I'm the Regional Administrator of the United States General Services Administration, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you this morning to the Alexander Hamilton U.S. Custom House. I'm sure you couldn't help but notice the magnificence of this facility as you entered here today. Not only is this the most beautiful structure in GSA's arsenal, and I say that as the regional administrator, but it's also GSA's premier historic federal building in New York City. But it is also one of our nation's top 10 legacy buildings in our national inventory. I'll welcome you all to take a bit of time today to explore and to look at some of the magnificence of this building. It was completed in 1907, and it was designed by one of the United States premier architects, Cass Gilbert, more famous for the Woolworth Building here in New York, just a few blocks north of here, and the United States Supreme Court. Just upstairs, there's this magnificent Grand Rotunda, and with its WPA frescoes, and outside the large four-seated figures representing the continents that are the work of Daniel Chester French, sculptor, and the imposing seating figure of Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial in our nation's capital. Some of you may recognize some of the, we are also very proud because the staircase was in Black Swan, and those of you who watch some of cable TV's Boardwalk Empire is also filmed in this facility. But the important thing, and the reason we're here today, like most of our neighbors in Lower Manhattan, this historic building also suffered from the ravages of Storm Sandy. However, when you look at the immense destruction of our greater community, we were lucky. And this building only experienced some minor flooding in the sub-basement and no significant damage to either its structure itself or the mechanical or electrical systems. Nonetheless, along with much of Lower Manhattan, it was without power, 6 days following the storm, communication, and heat for 12 days. As a result, it was the last of our local federal buildings to resume operation after Superstorm Sandy. This U.S. Custom House has often been called the Monument to Commerce. If you look on the facade in the Grand Rotunda in the Great Hall, you will see many design motifs, shells, dolphins, and more that pay homage to this nation's seafaring past, to the commerce trade that built the wealth of our nation. It was built at a time when radio and television were emerging technologies. And today, even the rotary dial telephone was a new idea. Today, communications are integral to the commerce and everyday life in the ways that were not even imagined back in 1907. And as integral to commerce and life is today, seagoing vessels were back then in the early days of our country. So perhaps it's fitting that these hearings following the storm that finally brought the sea inside this monument to seafaring trade takes place in this auditorium. Certainly, Superstorm Sandy challenged all of us in so many ways. For GSA and the rest of the federal agency community, the ability to maintain connections and communications became all important as we worked on recovery efforts. Supporting the needs of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, our federal customer agencies, and getting our impacted facilities like this one back up and operating again to continue to serve the public. So we are truly pleased to welcome our colleagues from the Federal Communications Commission here today as they conduct these important hearings. Since he was sworn in as its chairman in June of 2009, Julius Janikowski has focused the attention of the Federal Communications Commission on digital communications, particularly wired and wireless broadband, as well as advancing modern technologies for public safety. Under his leadership, the FCC has become a model for excellence in government. It gives me great pleasure, and I'm proud to introduce the FCC Chairman, Julius Janikowski. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Administrator Pease. Thank you very much for those remarks. Thank you for hosting us in this wonderful, historic building, of course, right here at the heart of some of the serious challenges of Hurricane Sandy. This is the first of the FCC's series of field hearings on the reliability and continuity of communications networks. There were many reasons to hold the first of these Sandy hearings here in New York. I don't know that this was the main reason, but it's true. This is where I'm from. I grew up on Long Island. I went to high school and college in Manhattan and worked here for many years. In fact, one of my very first jobs was working on an ambulance in New York City. I know these streets. I understand how people here suffered during Sandy. It's vital that the FCC be part of the solution in this area for the benefit of people who suffered in this area and for the benefit of people all over the country. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you to each of our participants. Thank you very much to the New York and New Jersey officials who demonstrated real leadership during the storm and the recovery process, including Governor Cuomo and Christie, Senator Schumer, Gillibrand, Lautenberg, and Menendez, Representatives Bishop, King, Pallone, and Sires, and Mayor Bloomberg. A number of those officials will have participants on our panels today. Thank you to my fellow commissioners who are here today, and to the staff of the FCC's Public Safety Bureau, led by David Turetsky, who organized today's hearing. And our commission, our Public Safety Bureau, have been working for many years to harness the power of communications technology to make the American people safer and more secure. I want to offer special thanks to all of the emergency personnel here today, not here today, who worked to help the victims of Sandy get through the storm and help communities bounce back. That includes both state and local emergency officials, as well as recovery teams from communications companies, many of whom risk their own safety to help others. I saw on the way in here today David Donovan, who runs the New York Broadcaster Association, and he took a minute to thank the FCC for the work that we did helping them provide coverage in New York, granting what we call STA, Special Temporary Authorities, to keep signals up. We did this for broadcasters, for mobile companies, and others. Also, working around the clock to facilitate fuel delivery. And as this will come up over the course of the day, that was one of the big issues that emerged over Sandy, making sure that fuel got to the places it needed to get. This included antenna towers, generators, and news trucks, as David reminded me this morning. Now, of course, primarily today, our thoughts and sympathies remain with the victims of this storm. Superstorm Sandy was one of the most devastating natural disasters ever to hit this region. It underscored something important, how essential modern communications like mobile and broadband have become to our daily lives. They connect us to family, to work, to emergency services. And we sure notice when we can't get through on our phones or connect to the internet or get TV or radio news. That's true all the time, and it's especially true in times of emergency, whether you're calling 911, checking on the well-being of loved ones, getting emergency information, or just trying to return to work in the days following a crisis. It's true for mobile and broadband, for broadcast and cable TV, for radio. Each communication service provides enormous benefits during times of emergency, and we benefit from the multiple sources of information and connectivity. And we also know the costs of losing service. In addition to illustrating the essential role of communication services, the unprecedented storm also revealed challenges that require a national dialogue on how to ensure the resiliency of communications networks and action to address communications outages and the need for resilient communications networks. When the storm occurred, the FCC activated our disaster information reporting system in order to assess the state of network outages. We coordinate with FEMA and state and local agencies on that. The data we received soon after the storm told us that about 25% of cell sites and cable services in the affected 10-state area were not operational. And of course, those figures were much greater in hard-hit areas of New York and New Jersey. I visited New York shortly after the storm, and I saw firsthand the devastation, particularly here in Lower Manhattan. Now, many of the challenges exposed by Sandy are complex. An extremely important example, the interrelation of our electric grid and our communications networks, two critical elements of modern infrastructure. The fact is, we rely on our electric grid to power individual devices, to power antenna towers and other elements of fixed and mobile communications networks, and to power the central offices, switches, and other sophisticated equipment that connect it all together. We may not know yet exactly what caused the Super Bowl power outage on Sunday, but people from New York and New Jersey already know the consequences of losing power and the consequences of aging infrastructure. It's why President Obama has made modernizing American infrastructure a national priority. Our nation's communications infrastructure is a vital part of our public safety and national security. The inability to communicate with family and emergency personnel during a disaster is simply unacceptable. We must meet this moment with smart action from all sectors to ensure that communications networks are working when people need them the most. Much has been done. Much more needs to be done. At the FCC, for example, in the last few years, we've worked to drive massive private investment in network infrastructure to modernize networks and improve service. Capital investment in U.S. wireless networks has grown by over 25% annually since 2009, and total investment in wired and wireless broadband infrastructure exceeded $60 billion last year alone, making this one of the largest sectors for private capital investment in the U.S. economy. Together with my fellow commissioners, we've taken steps at the FCC to launch wireless emergency alerts to allow local authorities to send warning and other texts to people in affected areas, to facilitate text to 911 on mobile phones and improve location accuracy for mobile 911 so emergency personnel can more quickly locate people in need. Last month, the FCC issued a detailed report examining the failures of 911 communications after the derecho, which caused massive power outages across the Mid-Atlantic this past summer. A key takeaway from that report was that many of the problems encountered at that time could have been avoided if known best practices had been followed. Today, we focus on what we can learn from Sandy, how we can ensure network reliability when we need it the most. We'll have two panels here this morning, the first on public and private sector responses to Sandy, and the second on assessing network resiliency, lessons learned from Sandy. This afternoon, we'll hold a hearing in New Jersey with an additional two panels, one on communicating during times of emergency and a second on new ideas to improve communication services. We'll be having two additional hearings in other parts of the country, and we look forward to learning from additional voices on the critical questions. Throughout this work, we're focused on advancing four core goals. Improving network resiliency. How can communications outages be prevented in the first place? Improving restoration. When outages do occur, how can network recovery be hastened? Empowering the public. How can the American people be better prepared and better cope with disasters? And unleashing technological solutions. How can new technologies be harnessed to promote the resiliency and restoration of communications networks, as well as emergency care and response? Our efforts are integrated with the work of the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force led by HUD Secretary Sean Donovan to make sure that all the communities impacted by Sandy bounce back and are better prepared in the event of future disasters. Working together, I believe we must and we can improve the reliability of our communications networks and enhance the safety of all Americans. So thank you for welcoming us here to New York. I'm looking forward to these panels. I expect this to be a productive day. And let me now introduce my colleague, Commissioner Mignon Clyburn. And thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To our distinguished panelists and to our audience, good morning. Good morning. Thank you. Thank you, Regional Administrator Peace, for your opening remarks. And on behalf of the Federal Communications Commission, I wish to express my gratitude to the General Services Administration and others responsible for making it possible for us to hold this critical forum. At the FCC, we are afforded the incredible privilege of having a front row seat to some amazing developments in information technology. And I can say without any doubt that we have a lot to be optimistic about when it comes to what the communications industry can accomplish. But when we are hit With major weather events such as Superstorm Sandy, we are humbled and are reminded that despite all of these great advances, we are still quite vulnerable. Our thoughts and prayers remain with all who suffered the loss of loved ones and property during Superstorm Sandy. I commend the efforts of first responders as well as ordinary citizens who demonstrated unprecedented charity towards their neighbors and communities. I was in Moncks Corner, South Carolina. Yes, there's a Moncks Corner, with family in September of 1999. During Hurricane Hugo, I was balled up in a corner, in a dark corner, listening to the first trees I ever loved being broken like toothpicks. I sat in fear as my grandmother's tin roofs from the barn, the smokehouse, and part of her own house were being pulled away by what at the time felt to me like a huge, heartless hand of a giant. So while the extent of Sandy's power and destruction were an unprecedented event for this region, many of us have firsthand felt the tragedy brought by natural disasters. We may not be able to prevent them from occurring, but what we can and must do is improve our readiness. Throughout the Sandy weather event, we heard several reports about how federal, state, and local governments, as well as industry, were engaged in extensive coordination to restore important services and infrastructure to communities. And as communications regulators, we must do all within our power to prepare our wired and wireless communications networks, 911 systems, and other infrastructure for future weather or unexpected events that are sure to follow. So I applaud Chairman Janikowski for his all-hands-on approach and for recognizing and declaring early on that this commission would come to New York, New Jersey, and other parts of this great nation to learn about the challenges we face when it comes to the reliability of communications networks. And I look forward to the panelists' testimonies and recommendations on these and other related policy areas. Thank you very much, and again, good morning.
And now, Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel.
Good morning. I want to start by noting that my grandfather began his career as a U.S. Customs officer here in New York City. So coming here to this place, this city, and this room feels a little bit like coming home. And like my grandfather, I am privileged right now to have a life in public service. And though I have only been at the Federal Communications Commission for a brief period of time, since that time, we have had more than our fair share of natural disasters, including the subject of today's hearing, Hurricane Sandy. These events caused not only immeasurable hardship on those affected, they often wreaked havoc on our nation's communication systems. And while we may not know with precision what the next storm or disaster brings, we do know that we must learn from what came before. So it's my hope today we can take away lessons and bring home facts that will help us make our nation's networks more resilient and the American people more safe. Now, I have made it a practice to visit public safety communications facilities when traveling around the country, and I am consistently amazed by the dedication and resolve of the people I meet and their simple, everyday heroism. But without question, the most powerful visits I have made so far were to areas recovering from storms. So following the summer's derecho storm in the mid-Atlantic, I toured one of the nation's most sophisticated public safety answering points in Virginia. The director of this center described an eerie quiet in the aftermath of this major storm as calls to 911 quickly and implausibly ceased. He said he knew instantly something was wrong. He was right, and lives were put in danger as a result. And following this fall's Hurricane Sandy, I toured a telecommunications central office in Lower New York to see the impact of the storm. In fact, it's just around the corner from here. Weeks after the floodwaters had receded from the streets, the subterranean rooms where our networks come together were still damp. Technicians rushed this way and that, trying to make sense of an impenetrable snarl of lines and the harms done to so many submerged switches and servers. I will never forget the post-apocalyptic look of the facility. It is only one image of a storm, in a storm with an infinite number of images of horror. But I also take away from the visit an image of extraordinary hope. The sheer energy and dedication of the New Yorkers working to repair the damage was nothing short of amazing. Following Hurricane Sandy, I also visited several towns along the coast of New Jersey. The storm surge propelled sand dunes blocks beyond beachfront neighborhoods, with cruel disregard for cars and houses that were in the way. A police chief in one town described how other towns had their communications knocked out for days. The mayor and a public safety official in another described the disaster in chilling detail, but also noted that without extensive outreach early on, including from broadcasters and social media, it could have been much worse. So from your trials and hardships, we have an opportunity to learn. We have an opportunity to understand how well our 911 systems responded. We have an opportunity to understand if systems dedicated to police, fire, and rescue officials performed, or if they fell short. We have an opportunity to understand what public communication is required in advance of a storm to help residents prepare and get the information they need to stay safe. We also have an opportunity to understand what it means when an increasing portion of the population no longer relies on traditional wireline phones. Today, 1 in 3 households relies exclusively on wireless phones. Wireless phones and the towers that serve them are dependent on commercial power. What happens when the power goes out? We know that after Hurricane Sandy, as Chairman Janikowski said, 1 in 4 wireless towers was out of service. So how do we make sure that backup power is where it needs to be and that our carriers have access to fuel for generators? And how do we make sure that consumers are prepared too, with backup batteries and solar chargers? So we have an opportunity to learn from your stories so that we can wrestle some good out of Hurricane Sandy. We need to take your lessons and apply them more broadly before the next storm hits or disaster devastates. So to our panelists, you are essential to this process. You will help us build this record. You will help us understand what happened and how public safety, infrastructure providers, and government can come together to make our communication systems strong. Because we need an honest accounting of the resiliency of our nation's digital age infrastructure. And with your help, we are going to make our networks more secure and all of us more safe. So thank you to you all for being here today and taking part in this event. And let me introduce my friend and colleague, Commissioner Pai.
Thank you, Commissioner Rosenworcel, for that introduction, and thank you, Administrator Peace and the General Services Administration for your hospitality. It's a privilege for me and my colleagues to be here in New York, and we look forward to participating in today's activities. For me, today's events are about listening and learning. Through this field hearing, as well as others to come, I hope that we will gain a richer understanding of the steps that we can take to improve the performance of our communications networks and to facilitate the timely transmission of critical information during natural disasters. Chairman Janikowski, thank you for holding today's hearing. Suffice it to say that there's much for us to learn. Our first job is to figure out what happened during and after Superstorm Sandy. How did people communicate with each other? Do they use wireline networks or wireless phones? How did they receive information about the storm? Were callers able to reach emergency services? And if not, why not? Were emergency personnel able to communicate with each other? Did copper lines weather the storm best? Did coaxial cable? Did fiber? Did wires attached to poles perform better or worse than those buried in conduits? And after the storm, how did repair efforts proceed? How quickly were networks restored? These are but a few questions to which we need the answers. Once we've determined what happened, we then must take the lessons learned and look to the future. Of course, there are some things that we already know. For one thing, we know that improving the resilience of our communications networks should be one of our major goals moving forward. Americans, particularly those in New York City, are intimately familiar with the slogan, "Too big to fail." Well, simply put, our communications networks are too important to fail. That is especially true during natural disasters, because the ability to communicate may be the difference between life and death. So we must examine what can be done and must be done to improve these networks in order to minimize disruptions when disaster strikes again, as it inevitably will. We also know that reliable power is essential to communications during public safety emergencies. Unfortunately, during Sandy, persistent and widespread power outages affected several communications networks. At one point, about 1/4 of cell sites across 10 states were out of commission, and a substantial portion of those outages resulted from a loss of power. Backup power can prevent networks from failing, but flooding will ruin even the sturdiest diesel generator. Large stockpiles of fuel in urban areas may not be practical. And even the best battery or largest fuel tank will eventually give out. So we also need to ask what steps we can take to avoid power outages in the first place and to bring our communications networks back on the grid sooner rather than later. To do that, we may need to bridge the communication gap between utilities and network operators. In Sandy's aftermath, for example, we have heard complaints that local power companies did not coordinate with network operators. If this is true, it has to change. These companies share poles and conduits with each other, and a coordinated response to service restoration can bring all networks back online more quickly and more efficiently. Disjointed service repair efforts only prolong the time that customers are left in the dark or cut off from communications. And utilities and communications companies need to start planning for the next disaster now, looking at ways to harden their networks to avoid future outages. Another thing we know is that new internet protocol-based technologies can make communications more reliable for the public during an emergency. Traditional 911 services, while immensely valuable, rely on older copper networks and selective routers to connect the public with emergency personnel and to collect the information that they need. Just last week, I visited a public safety answering point in Virginia. I heard firsthand how a single point of failure took down their operations last summer. That's unacceptable. When the IP transition comes to emergency services, when we start deploying next generation 911, all of this will change. In Pike County, Pennsylvania, a short trip from New York City, the 911 dispatch moved into a state-of-the-art facility last year. A mere 18 days later, Hurricane Sandy struck. But Pike County 911 reported that the new system held up extraordinarily well. No outages occurred at that 911 center, even though Pike County itself was without power for almost a week. One major reason is that Pike County, like other next-generation facilities, employs fail-safes to ensure that emergency services keep running. Fiber links the two Pike County facilities, allowing one center to take over for the other in the event of an outage, or to handle overflow and mass call events. Mark Fletcher, an expert on next-generation 911 services, recently pointed out that if you call 911 during a mass call event, you usually get a busy signal. But if you hang up the phone and call your airline to check on your flight, you're going to get through. That's because in the airline industry, among others, people are already taking advantage of technology that routes calls to the call center with availability, not just the closest one. We need these kinds of next-generation systems that enable not just new technology, but enhanced coordination and cooperation among public safety officials across this country to ensure quick and effective emergency response. And that's why upgrading our emergency systems to next-generation 911 should be a top priority. Yet another thing we know is that our citizens may not need to contact emergency personnel if they receive timely, thorough information over the airwaves. I'm especially looking forward to hearing from broadcasters and others today about their efforts to keep the public safe and informed during the storm. For example, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie took to the airwaves on New Jersey 101.5's Ask the Governor show to provide information and field questions from listeners just as Sandy was making landfall. I'm eager to hear about the efforts of other broadcasters and local news teams during and after the storm. Finally, we know that the emergency personnel and service staff who worked the ground during Sandy deserve our continuing thanks. We rely so heavily on all of you for the thousands of thankless tasks that you do every day. And when things get tough, you make the sacrifice. I was especially touched by the story of an NYPD officer, Artur Kasperzak, who was killed during Sandy while escorting 7 members of his family to safety in Staten Island. My humble thanks go out to Officer Kasperzak and to all of our emergency personnel for their vital service to communities across this country. In closing, I look forward to learning and to listening today. The witnesses we will hear from will help ensure that the Federal Communications Commission both understands the problems caused by Superstorm Sandy and has the information that it needs to move forward and to make a difference. Thanks to all the witnesses for coming, and I look forward to their testimony. Finally, our colleague, Commissioner McDowell, could not be here, but he does wish to participate by video, and so you will see a short presentation in a moment along those lines. Thank you once again for your hospitality.
First, I apologize for not being with you today in person. Congress recently asked me to testify at a hearing regarding another matter. That hearing is also scheduled for today, so unfortunately I must remain in Washington. In spite of my inability to be in New York this morning and in Hoboken this afternoon, I'm very pleased that the Federal Communications Commission is holding these important hearings, and I thank my friend and colleague, Chairman Janikowski, for his leadership. We must all ensure that the reliability of our nation's communications networks in times of emergency is second to none. Although none of us can prevent a natural disaster, we can and must work together to make sure that Americans are able to contact emergency response services as well as family and friends in times of crisis. I send my deepest condolences to those of you who lost loved ones as a result of Superstorm Sandy. And I thank the heroic emergency teams who have been working diligently in the recovery efforts, which, unfortunately, are still ongoing. Sandy was a highly destructive storm. As we all know, when disasters occur, mobile and wired communications technologies become literal lifelines. But they also create challenges. Therefore, in order to plan for future emergencies, I welcome the opportunity to learn more about what went right and what went wrong. Even though I'm not physically there with you today, I will study the important information we learned today quite closely. I look forward to continuing to work with you, as well as my colleagues at the SEC and other government agencies on these critical issues. Thank you.
Will all panelists for panel 1 please come to the stage?
Good morning. I'm David Turetsky, Chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau of the FCC. Like the chairman, my roots are here. I was born in New York City. I grew up in New Jersey and worked later on in life in New York City while I lived there. We have a very distinguished panel, and I'd like to introduce them and explain the procedure that will follow today. The panelists' bios are available in the materials that are available to you, so I'm not going to recount their very, very impressive backgrounds in any detail. And I'm going to ask each panelist a question. They'll have up to 5 minutes to answer. Then we'll go to the commissioners for another 5 minutes each. And depending on where we are at that point, we'll either have some follow-up questions from me or we'll be done. We've also invited the panelists to submit longer materials if they so choose to the record so that they can have an opportunity to elaborate even beyond what we get a chance to cover in the questioning today. Let me introduce the panelists and then we'll come back and I'll ask a question to each. First, Rahul Merchant. He is the Chief Information and Innovation Officer and Commissioner of the New York City Department of Information Technology and Communications. Next, Jack Schneerman. He's the City Manager of the City of Long Beach in New York. Next is Michael Corso. He's the Managing Director of the New York Department of Public Service, and he's joined by Peter McGowan, who is the General Counsel of the New York Public Service Commission. Next to him is Cliff Abio of Crown Castle, USA, where he is the Vice President of Engineering and Operations. And finally, Sean Kielty, who's the Region 2 Emergency Communications Coordinator for FEMA. Thank you. It's a distinguished panel. And now let's turn to Mr. Merchant, who's responsible for the New York City's IT infrastructure and oversight of the implementation of key technology initiatives. And the first question is, Mr. Merchant, can you please give us an overview of the principal communications challenges you faced that arose from the Superstorm from your perspective, the response, and any thoughts on how to enhance resilience and speed restoration in the future?
Thank you, Mr. Turetsky, for the question, and thank you, Chairman Janikowski, and the commissioners for hosting these hearings, and welcome to New York. We here at Department of Information Technology and Telecommunication in New York manage all of internal as well as some parts of external telecommunications at the City of New York. Hurricane and Superstorm Sandy did significant damage to our external communications in New York, but the internal communications and other technology pieces withstood the storm quite well. As we watched from our offices, from our Office of Emergency Management, as well as our headquarters in Brooklyn, we saw a flooding of central offices located in the same floodplains in Lower Manhattan. We saw call surges on public telecommunication network. We also saw quite a bit of fuel shortages to power some of the cell towers, antennas, and other areas. Among the most critical communication system today are wireless networks for us. Wireless carrier infrastructure throughout the 5 boroughs consist of thousands of cell towers, and we saw degradation as well as destruction of about 25% of the capacity. And the sources of this degradation, we thought, was due to 3 main areas. Number one, damage to the backhaul on which all the cell towers depend on to operate on a day-to-day basis. Second was damage to the critical electrical infrastructure that could not allow the cell tower as well as the backhaul to operate. And third was large call volume. As far as our internal infrastructure was concerned, New York City operates our own CityNet, which is our own fiber. We also have our wireless network called NiceWin, as well as our own 800 megahertz and other radio networks. We prepared in advance for all possibilities and were able to keep the infrastructure up during the entire time and after Sandy. Over and above that, we also ensured that our main communication vehicles, which is our website and our radio networks, were hardened before the Superstorm arrived, which was nyc.gov, our main website. Our 311 network, which did rely extensively on public telecommunication network, which we saw due to the central office damage. We, along with the commercial network providers, had to reroute all of our call volume to our CityNet and then to another central office in Brooklyn. And as I said, our wireless technologies, since we had hardened quite a bit of our wireless technologies, we withstood quite a bit of damage that came our way. As we move forward and as we look at the recommendations, I'd love to discuss them in detail as we move forward during the hearings. There are 2 main areas of recommendation that I would look for. One is, of course, providing resiliencies. In this day and age of better technologies, we should be able to provide a longer battery life to our cell towers and other cell infrastructure, and all the other resiliencies that we should be able to provide. And the main goal ought to be during the time of emergencies. And after that, our residents, citizens, and all our customers should have available to them some way of communicating with the governments, emergency officials, and their loved ones so that they can be helped in case of an emergency. And second is providing information. Just like regular utilities provide information on when their infrastructure is down and what can be expected from the utilities, we should be able to provide similar information on when the telecommunication systems are going to be up for our residents, citizens, and our customers. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now to Jack Schneerman, who led the hard-hit city of Long Beach on Long Island throughout the storm as the city manager. Mr. Schneerman, what were the communications issues caused by Superstorm Sandy in Long Beach, and are there unique challenges that face local governments in response and restoration of communication services in their communities?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Turetsky, and thank you to the commissioners for allowing us this opportunity to speak in regards to the devastation the city of Long Beach and other barrier communities experienced in the wake of Superstorm Sandy. We have quite a few things to cover, so I'm going to get right to it. We were able to effectively communicate and coordinate with our partners on the governing side during, before, and even after the storm. This effective communication produced an impressive array of resources to assist with our emergency response efforts. In fact, one of the calls and one of the last calls we were able to make in the middle of the night resulted in Senator Schumer securing a much-needed generator for our water plant to restore service. Unfortunately, however, we faced a variety of obstacles as we executed our crisis communications plan. we found that there is significant room for improvement with regards to wireless carriers, infrastructure, and response. Here are some of the challenges we faced. Once the storm hit, we lost power and backup power to critical infrastructure. We had no access to computers, telephone, cable, and internet. In fact, all mobile communications were lost. Our communications redundancies failed. The city possesses redundant services as a contingency, and if we lose one, we hope to have the alternate option available. But those all failed. And now, over 3 months later, Verizon has still not been fully reinstated. We're awaiting final restoration of City Hall's fax lines. We completely lost the ability to receive 911 calls locally. 911 calls were routed then to Nassau County and routed through Nassau County Mobile Command Bus back to Long Beach. We sent personnel to Nassau County Office of Emergency Management in the wake of the storm for assistance and to pick up 500 megahertz radios so we could communicate with essential city personnel and coordinate first responders. Even with all these obstacles in our way, we were still able to coordinate with government. And that's the key. The government side worked. But unfortunately, we faced some obstacles to restoring our communications. The lack of communication and response from service providers was extremely disconcerting. All cell towers in the city were down during the storm, and service providers were nowhere to be found. We spent over a week trying to obtain mobile cell towers, a COW, cell on wheels. Long Beach reached out to one of the carrier's customer support departments, explained the devastation, and inquired about the carrier deploying a cell on wheels. The customer service rep replied, "You might want to look that up on the internet. I don't know what that is." Well, obviously, ironically, we had no internet at that time. We contacted each carrier individually, which was an incredibly time-consuming process, as we were constantly passed along to different 1-800 numbers. The city's IT department flagged a Verizon tech off the street to help us find out who in Verizon could help. We needed to get somebody to come and help us. And Verizon has a facility in Long Beach, and we were still unable to receive assistance in a timely fashion. When communicating with other government entities and other private entities, we knew who to talk to. However, we did not have a point of contact with the cell phone carriers for emergencies. The biggest issue with all these facilities is that they must be equipped with natural gas-powered generators with automatic transfer switches so they can be immediately powered by the generator when the power goes out. Technological roadblocks hindered our ability to get our information out to our residents. We had communication with our residents, and it was difficult, and it yet was our main priority. In a time of crisis, it is just so crucial to be able to reach your residents and tell them that important information to maintain a sense of calm and order. We did overcome our technological limitations and executed our crisis communications plan with a variety of workarounds that perhaps we'll get to later in this hearing. But constructively going forward, we have 9 quick recommendations to share about how we can do all better together going forward. Number 1, going forward, communication infrastructure must be built with resiliency. I look forward to getting into that in a little more depth as we go. Number 2, it's crucial that cell carriers with infrastructure maintain contact data and emergency service for themselves with municipalities. Number 3, it's got to be easier to obtain cows in a time of crisis. Number 4, LIPA must have open communication with the communication carriers as well. Number 5, we feel it's extremely important to continue to build and invest in the 211 system as well as 311. Number 6, hardwiring adequate constituent surface capabilities into offices of emergency management are crucial. Number 7, New York State Department of Homeland Security satellite communication vehicles must be deployed across the state to perform exactly as they did during this emergency. That worked. Number 8, there must be an educational campaign for residents with alternative contacts, cell phone, SMS, and so forth for use in a time of crisis. And finally, number 9, multi-line programmable electric signs, which we used this time around, must be made available easily for emergencies as they can be used as supplemental communication. In conclusion, we were faced with many obstacles in executing our aggressive crisis communications plan. But as a city, we came together to work around those obstacles. Based on our on-the-ground experience, we recommend improving the broader communications infrastructure so that first responders and residents alike can communicate effectively in times of crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to Michael Corso and to Peter McGowan. Michael Corso is the managing director, as I said, of the New York State Department of Public Service and is the representative of New York State who oversees the offices of telecommunications, consumer services and policy, energy efficiency and the environment, and industry and government relations. And Peter is the general counsel of the Public Service Commission. And I'd like to ask a question, and I'll let you answer it, whichever of you cares to. The state played a central role in the response to the storm and efforts to speed the restoration of communications. Can you describe the response effort you were part of and share your thoughts on those efforts, including how to enhance restoration efforts in the future?
Let me take a stab at that. Thank you very much for the question and the opportunity to address you today. In essence, emergency management is about executing a series of interdependent priorities quickly and effectively in a dynamic environment under tremendous pressure. I had the privilege of being required to spend an evening in the state energy office management, the bunker. And I'm not an emergency, responder kind of person. I'm just a lawyer. But the observation that I made was that it was an incredibly intense effort. It was incredibly real-time oriented. It was very dynamic. It's an extremely complex, sometimes frustrating, but ultimately an amazing problem-solving operation. And one of the observations, I guess, that really stayed with me was the importance of real-time information. Real-time information is an incredibly valuable commodity which is used to effectively allocate resources in a crisis. It was also interesting to me, when you're standing in this bunker, there are probably 30 different agencies with, stations that are processing information, flowing information through, taking problems and solving problems as quickly as possible. So this is an operation that has the state working very closely with the counties and then through to the local governments with the federal government, also all working together to try to identify the most pressing problem and solve it as quickly as possible. It was also interesting that the electric utilities were in the bunker with us to help that real-time flow of information. The Department of Public Service in these events provides a vital link between the state's emergency response operation and telecommunications service providers through regular reporting of telecommunications, among other things, networks and critical infrastructure via real-time outage reporting protocols. We also do energy and other things. In the last 17 months, the department has witnessed 2 unprecedented catastrophic weather events. And although the cause of the damage and the geographic impact were vastly different, we have observed certain common themes regarding the interdependencies between electric restoration efforts and telecommunications restoration efforts and the resiliency of telecommunications networks in the face of catastrophic weather events and their subsequent restoration of service. Let me just give a quick overview. During Superstorm Sandy, telecommunications systems were severely disrupted as a result of catastrophic flooding, wind damage, cable damage, extended power outages. At the peak of Sandy's disruptions, over 500,000 wired telephone lines were out of service. Between 15% and 60% of wireless service networks were inoperable in New York City, Long Island, and Westchester, with nearly 3,500 cell sites knocked offline due to power and other problems. In the aftermath of Sandy, our department worked closely with the New York State Ready Commission, which, along with the Respond Commission, were established by Governor Cuomo to explore recommendations that focus on preparing the telecommunications and other industries for disasters through planning, hardening, and resiliency. But there was a particular focus on wireless because of the importance that wireless plays. It's essential that the state work with the FCC and with the telecommunications industry to maintain high standards of performance to mitigate network outages during emergencies and ensure the quickest possible restoration. Let me make 3 observations. Interdependencies abound, so it's critical that we work in an integrated and coordinated fashion. First responders need communications, communications need power, so priorities among priorities must be understood and effectively executed, which requires a lot of data-intensive systems to work well. Following disasters, we know that wireless voice service and messaging is a primary method of communication for the general public, emergency response agencies, and disaster relief organizations. And while we've witnessed the ability of wireless providers to react well to emergencies and power outages to restore network elements within their control, more is needed to improve the resiliency of critical wireless infrastructure and the underlying power and backhaul systems necessary to maintain service during emergencies. So interdependency is absolutely critical. The second observation is information flow. It has to be quick, it has to be uniform, it has to be efficient and sufficiently granular to be actionable in the real world of restoration. The final observation is that systems have to be made more resilient to better survive the new norm. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Peter. I'd like to turn now to Clifford Abbio, who's the Vice President of Engineering and Operations at Crown Castle USA. And for background, Crown Castle owns, operates, and manages over 29,000 wireless communication sites in the United States. Cliff, the question I have for you is, please tell us a little bit about what you do to prepare for events like Superstorm Sandy, harden your towers, and whether carriers can site generators at those towers, as well as any lessons learned about ways to maintain or restore communications capabilities.
Okay, thank you, David. As you said, we own, operate, and lease approximately 30,000 towers in the United States. We're basically a real estate provider to the wireless industry, leasing space both on our towers and on the ground. We provide lighting in accordance with FAA regulations, and we do not typically provide power or telco to our tenants. We do not typically own antennas on the towers or the electronics at the base of the tower. The response to Sandy really began with good preparation. Crown Castle has a defined hurricane preparation program. We have towers that, with design speeds of greater than 74 miles per hour, those are designated within the hurricane zone. On these, we perform inspections annually. It begins in February, and between February and June, we perform all of our inspections that are necessary and complete all maintenance issues. We hold calls every 2 weeks to track progress. We do have a defined disaster preparation plan, which we enacted during Superstorm Sandy. We monitor the National Hurricane Center for landfall threats. We hold calls 4 days prior to any threat of landfall, and we begin readying the local teams in response. As one example, we do review any of our towers that are in the path of a storm, and we make sure that any tickets that are open on dead trees are removed so that any threat to our structures is avoided. We get contractors on standby. We make sure that any materials they think they need for that particular storm they have. We make sure that all trucks are fueled and tools are ready. After landfall, we go into an incident response, which is basically based on the NIM structure. For Sandy specifics, after the storm had hit, we basically, our first thing we do is we check the safety and well-being of our employees and their families, make sure we understand sort of what that whole situation is. We ran from the National Hurricane Center all of the wind data through our towers, and basically identified about 1,000 or 1,100 of our towers that were impacted by greater than 40-mile-an-hour storm winds. We established a reconnaissance plan both with troops on the ground. We also used a backup of aerial reconnaissance in case we couldn't get to sites, and actually ended up using that in the storm. Our ground teams were severely hampered by road closures, by availability of fuel, availability of lodging. We did utilize that aerial reconnaissance on over 100 sites. When I asked the teams what could have been done better in this particular storm, they said that really they could have used some special access to get to sites, and really could have used some help getting fuel. They were really slowed down. It took us about a week to get to those 1,100 sites, which was longer than what we had expected. We could use some help with federal government and transporting and getting security clearance when necessary, and that was pretty much it in terms of the response. As far as hardening and generators, our tenants have generators on about half of our towers, and those towers that do have generators is an average of about 1.3 generators per site, and that's pretty much what we have.
Thank you. Can I just ask you, since there's just a little time left there?
Sure.
Do they share the generators, or does each carrier who has an antenna on the site have their own generators?
Typically, there's not a lot of sharing of generators. We do have some, but it's very few. We did perform a pilot program in 2009 for sharing generators. We found quite a few things out from that pilot. We found that the cost to install in a shared location requires a lot more trenching and drives the cost way up. We found that for one tenant it's about $50,000 with generator cost plus the trenching. For two it's about $70,000. For three it's about $90,000. We did find challenges with Clean Water Act, with Clean Air Act, noise levels, hazardous material storage, OSHA requirements. We determined that we were not in the best position to figure out where they needed generators, where we put them. We made sure we had at least one tenant that was interested. We had zero lease up from any of the other tenants in the 3 to 4 years that they've been there. We found that it's costly to maintain them, and further, we don't know the future requirements that our tenants would need. So it's hard to kind of size the generator right if we don't understand sort of what they need in the future. And the generator companies tell us it's important to get the size of the generator right. And if needs in the future drive up higher than what you have installed, replacing the generator is pretty expensive. Let me conclude by saying that we are happy to work with our customers and our tenants to work out a shared program that makes sense. We think it's going to be pretty heavily required that capital cost sharing be part of that program.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks. Let's go now to Sean Kilty. Sean works with FEMA, and he leads the emergency communications efforts in FEMA Region 2, which includes New York and New Jersey, and was involved in this disaster as well as many other previous disasters. Sean, I'd like you to describe your activities and the role that FEMA played, and you played through FEMA, in responding to the Superstorm and restoring communications, including how that fits in with what others in the public and private sectors do, and share any thoughts about potential improvements.
Thank you for the question, sir. Thank you, fellow panelists, commissioners from the FCC, and members of the audience. I don't know that 5 minutes would be sufficient time to delve into every aspect of our response to Hurricane Sandy, as I am still technically deployed to our Queens JFO in support of the transition from the response to the recovery phase. But I can illustrate some points. Well, one thing I wanted to do was review, for the sake of clarity, exactly what FEMA does during disaster. As we can see from the panelists, there are both state, local, and non-governmental organizations that have tremendous emergency management capability, whether that's police, fire, emergency services, or their own suite of emergency communications equipment that they can deploy and use during disaster or in anticipation of disaster. When the state believes that there is going to be a shortage or believes that they will require more support during a storm, that's when they come to FEMA, which is the lead organization for any kind of federal interaction. It's important to note both the Stafford Act and the 10th Amendment to the Constitution prevent FEMA from liaising directly or dealing directly with the locals. We deal only with the state and then with non-governmental organizations as well as our federal partners. This actually dovetails nicely into a story. The first story I'd like to get into is the difference between FEMA, as I kind of set it out. We are basically a coordination body for anything the state may need from the federal government and among the federal government. So if the FCC has a tool like their Thames vehicle, which we used on Long Island to determine exactly where the outages were, to make sure that any reports that were coming out matched in real time, as Mr. Corso said, real-time information is the most valuable and most important. It does have a shelf life. Matched up to our reports, they were able to provide that. And they did an outstanding job. For us, in addition to being a coordination body, we're also a checkbook. We engage in something called a cost share. It's usually about 75% federal government, 25% state government. There are some exceptions, but that is generally the rule. So coordination body and checkbook, what we learned from our perspective when it came to Hurricane Sandy is that primarily it is relationships, not technology. You have to remain, you have to be both proactively and have proactive initiative as well as remain flexible or reactive. So you want to react flexibly to as the situation changes. And fuel is always going to be a huge concern. The fuel is inextricably linked to communications, as Mr. Corso brilliantly marshaled in his brief. That was I can't improve upon that. But based on that, a story I'd like to share with you is as the Regional Emergency Communications Coordinator for FEMA Region 2, I have many federal partners, but one that I deal with on a regular basis is Mr. Chris Tuttle, who's in the audience today, with the Office of Emergency Communications. Now I, because of the Stafford Act and the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, cannot deal with locals regularly. He, as the Regional Emergency Coordinator for the Office of Emergency Communications, is able to reach out to the locals directly. And a conversation that we had very well in advance of Hurricane Sandy, when it looked like it was definitely going to make an impact in New York, was he was taking it upon himself to do something that was part of his regular everyday duty, but to do it on an almost constant basis. So he reached out to Public Safety Radio and made sure that Public Safety Radio, not only in New York, but in New Jersey, he was getting the information on a almost hourly basis. Now, he did this because he knew there might be a problem. He did it because he had tremendous initiative, and it wound up working out. It could not have worked out better from our perspective, because that was one less thing that we had to worry about in the initial landfall of the hurricane, because Chris was providing us with near real-time information. And he did this not only prior to the storm, but once we activated him with something called a mission assignment, where FEMA kind of pays for his work after that. He did it in the field to such a degree that it was, could not have been better from our perspective. So that was a tremendous asset where he had the initiative to just reach out to me, tell me he was going to do this, and then continue doing that throughout the disaster. And that alleviated a lot of the bureaucracy that we experienced and the morass we kind of get sucked into during the actual response to the emergency. Another very brief story that involves the New York State Troopers. New York State Troopers had a problem with power and were unable to communicate with each other from Long Island. I had a prior existing relationship with a state trooper named Sergeant Becker. We had a professional relationship, known each other for maybe 5 years now. He reached out directly to me in order to see what federal assets we had already in the field. And it just happened that literally across the street at Republic Airport from his barracks, we had an MCOV, which is this vehicle that can support cellular audio and video communications through a satellite, and had its own independent power source. It wasn't being used yet. It was just being pre-staged. I ran it through my chain to make sure that everything was all the I's were dotted and T's were crossed from a FEMA perspective, but because of the relationship that existed between us and because he was a state representative, we were able to deliver within an hour exactly what they needed in a process that would normally have taken at least 48 hours to complete during that stage of the storm. So again, it's relationships over technology. The technology will exist somewhere, although perhaps not as accessible or as mass as we'd like to. There's not as many of them as we'd like to reach out to. But the relationships, knowing who to talk to when and how to get things done is very important. I know I'm running a minute over, and I'm going to try to wrap it up with fuel. As Mr. Corso said, the fuel was our number one problem when it came to, from our perspective, the coordination of the emergency communications aspect of the response. It did, because Sandy was primarily a rain event, not a wind event, and flooding was a much bigger concern than, say, during a disaster like Hurricane Irene. Fuel became the hottest commodity. And I think that whatever we can do to improve, whether it's a prescriptive mission assignment or whether it's improving the actual power being allotted in reserve to the technology that's threatened, will go the longest way as far as preserving the positive communication you're able to derive from that equipment. And with that, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Kelsey. And just to clarify, the TEMS service that the FCC provided for the benefit of the audience is essentially a drive testing that helps gauge the coverage and strength of signals that are out in the marketplace, so that the responders have some additional information about where cell signals are effectively reaching people and where they aren't. With that, let me turn to Commissioner Clyburn and ask whether you've got questions. I see. Neither do I.
Sure, thank you. As I'd mentioned, we think resiliency is obviously crucial. We saw a situation where all the cell phone carriers went out, and so not only did residents not have a form of communication, but as I had explained earlier, the first responders, and that's particularly crucial and devastating in an environment where folks rely on cell phones as their primary source of communications. So specifically, some observations of our folks that came forward were generators ought to be built in to the cell phone carriers. Just like gas stations should have generators, as we've all learned, communications infrastructure needs to have generators. Backup batteries are a necessity. Currently, backup batteries only last about 8 hours. We need greater contingency for when we have prolonged outages. And all of the communication equipment must be located above flood level. The only carrier that we were able to get service from right after the storm was T-Mobile. This was because all of their equipment was located well above flood level. They also had dedicated fiber optic lines that were not affected by the loss of copper-based phone line communication after the storm.
Thank you. And also, you were very complimentary about the robust coordination between, state, federal, and I know local. What can we do more in terms of, assisting Long Beach now? And how do you see, from your vantage point, us improving upon the reliability of the communications network? So if you were seated next to the chairman, who I think I have to make up to in a second, how would you, what would you do?
Well, first of all, thank you for that opportunity, and a special thank you.
Anything's possible.
And we should give a special thank you on behalf of the City of Long Beach to Senator Schumer for stepping forward in the immediate aftermath of the storm, not only in a variety of fronts, but being forward-looking and saying, hey, look, this is an issue that the FCC has to tackle, and so thank you to you for actually bringing it forward. That's extremely appreciated. But I think what we've learned is we've got to stage those cows within cities like Long Beach. We've got to have access to them. We've got to have good infrastructure on the wireless side, not only so that we can communicate with each other and our first responders, but so that our residents can receive the messages. As we got our communications back, we were sending, we executed what I would argue is an excellent crisis communications plan through a variety of means: text, SMS, Swift 9/11, email, Facebook. We were omnipresent. However, the challenge was there wasn't necessarily anyone there on the resident side to hear us. And so they've got to be there to hear us. We look back, at what our successes were. And there were basically two major successes in the immediate aftermath of the storm. The first was maintaining public order, with great thanks to our police commissioner and our first responders, and coordinating the National Guard and the state police and all the different law enforcement agencies. The second, ironically, was communications, and yet it was our biggest obstacle. So we look back and say, just think how much better we could have done. In those first several days when we were relying upon flyers that came out every day precisely at 10:30 a.m. and were distributed all throughout the city, and even were distributed by police on bullhorns through the streets before we could even produce flyers. Just think how much, what the residents felt in those first moments when there was nobody, when they couldn't get any information, when they were cut off, when there was one woman particularly, one story that comes to mind where there was a woman who passed away of natural causes, an elderly woman, and her daughter had to walk literally a mile and a half from her home to police headquarters just to say, listen, my mom has passed, and I thought I should tell somebody so that things could go appropriately. There was no other way for her to get that message out. It was very sad. And we look forward to your leadership in assisting us in improving the communications infrastructure. So next time we're able to communicate not just before and after, but during the immediate storm event and during the immediate moments after.
Thank you. And with the remaining seconds, I'm not sure if I'm going to have time, but Mr. Kelty or Mr. Corso. Mr. Corso, you mentioned what we've been saying internally about us, preparing or getting more resilient for the new norm. One of the stories one of the takeaways that I had, and we won't have time to answer the question, one of the takeaways that I had was I remember so vividly this gentleman who English was not his first language, who was literally stuck because he had no idea that the subways were going to stop running at 7 o'clock that evening. So I thought about him and I thought about others, the 54 million persons with disabilities. And how do we best, communicate, with, those populations where there, are additional challenges? How can we improve upon, that delivery? And what were the good and the more challenging things, that happened during the Superstorm that we need to work on? Again, I'm a bit over time, so I don't know if you will allow a couple of seconds or if they can integrate it in their next series.
Why don't we allow a quick answer to that? Go ahead.
The quick answer is the same as all the other answers, which is resiliency, hardening, and improving the communications reliability. It's critically important because those same communities that you ask about, Commissioner, are receiving information the same way as all Americans, all New Yorkers, all local families, folks, businesses. All the customers are trying to get access to the information, and they do it through the technology afforded to us now. The real big issue that I wanted to just add is the coordination of communications and electricity is very critical, and we've learned a lot about that in the past, and we've learned much more about it now. And if we coordinate those two entities, those two industries better, the opportunity to accelerate commercial power restoration and therefore telecommunications restoration is greater. So we're prepared to work with you, we hope, and other industry representatives and other stakeholders to ensure the speed in which we can best get services back in order to the best of our ability. And one of those things is human ability. It's getting people to coordinate and prioritize in a way that will make effective the work that we're doing, despite the fact that there is such a tragedy that we're facing with regard to weather and natural storm incidents.
Thank you, Mr. Corso. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Thank you all for your testimony. I want to start with a really high-level question. It's really important that we come back from this experience. We identify what failed, and we work together to fix it. But I think it's just as important for us to identify what went right. Because in what went right, we'll have lessons that we can export to other communities that might in the future face similar problems with communications. So for as many of you as would like to speak, I would like to ask you what you think went right.
Why don't we start with Commissioner Merchant and go down the line for anybody who wants to answer that.
Thank you, Commissioner, for the question. I think a lot did go right. I think the communication before Sandy arrived, in case of New York, we were able to let our residents know who was supposed to evacuate, where they were supposed to go, and how they were supposed to get help. I think a lot of that preparedness worked very well, and things went right. Folks were able to evacuate in time. The communications worked very, very well. Our website stayed up. So all the preparing for Sandy did help, and it went. Most of those things did go right. After Sandy, in spite of a lot of criticism of the private network providers, they did work with us. In particular, I can point out Verizon. We did have calls 3 times a day in terms of how they were going to restore the services. So those things did go right but it was after the fact. But there was quite a bit of cooperation from them and other network providers in providing us cell on wheels, cell on light trucks. So after the fact, there were a lot of things that also did go right. But if I may, I think one of the things that we could and we should talk about is definitely resiliency and hardening and sharing information before the storm. I think that could have prevented a lot of hardship on our residents and the citizens.
Very briefly, we were able to deliver comprehensive communications to our residents before the storm, and that was extremely effective. And we were able to coordinate with other levels of government before the storm and during and after the storm. That was also extremely effective. There was good lines of communication open. We had folks in Nassau County OEM. We had constant communication with the county executive, with the governor's folks, and the governor directly, and that, as well as our senators, and that was appreciated. And it made things work smoothly, and we were able to deploy tremendous resources and assets to the city for emergency response as a result of that. And I would highlight that even LIPA, which has been obviously a major boogeyman after the storm, we found a model that worked. Several days after the storm, we got a mid-level management team from LIPA, literally locked them in City Hall for 10 days. They slept and ate in City Hall, and we were able to work together to get things back up and running quicker and point at the map, how are we doing over here? How are we doing over there? So, and when can we get this up? And that worked. And so I think the lesson for us is we need to replicate those successes on the private sector side with the cell carriers, get them in the Office of Emergency Management, work with them directly and say, hey, we need the cows. We need this network up, that network up, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you. I agree with my colleagues. I think the preparation was something that's very successful. The governor really ramped up emergency preparation since he's been governor. When Peter reviewed our remarks, one of the things he shared was that the utilities were in the bunker in force, and that helped communication and prioritization much better than we had before. And if we can improve upon that and strengthen that and have better relationships, because I think my colleague from FEMA really pointed out that it's really a lot about relationships and being able to communicate and understand each other where needs are most highest priority and what we need to get done and how fast we can do those things. It's really the human element that's critically important. And another success is that New Yorkers all came together and be able to be as resilient as they could be in being able to be available for each other and support what was before us, because nobody expected it could be this bad. We were prepared for a storm. We were not prepared for Sandy. And that's because nobody thought a 15-foot tidal wave, if I could use that word, because it was so unclear that that would happen. What were the ramifications of that kind of flooding? When the sea meets the land, it's just something new. And as Peter also reviewed in our comments, it's the new norm. We've got to think really hard and really fast about what we're going to do futuristically, as we've seen some very significant storms in our country, Katrina just 7 years ago, and then now Sandy, that are of a magnitude that we've really got to pay attention to and start to be more resilient as a community, as a society, and as a country.
Okay, I'll be really brief because we're out of time. But I think our preparation plan worked really well. It's something we practice all the time. And when this storm hit, we made the first call to the director in the East area. He said, "I'm already ready," and he was already underway. So that whole preparation and practicing that has really paid us benefits. In fact, during the storm, or after the storm, when we did our reconnaissance, we found only one site where a tree had fallen on top of a guy wire, and it didn't impact the guy wire at all. We removed it in retention, and everything was good. But really, something that Sean had mentioned earlier is really important, and it's something that's been said a couple of times. Being flexible and able to adapt to what the crisis presents is really important. In this case, we had lots of things. We had contractors, we had planes on standby, and we had to use a lot of those things. And bringing resources, capital resources and human resources to the issue just as it presents itself is what paid dividends for us.
And I'll be equally brief. Just to echo everything that my colleagues have said up here, I believe wholeheartedly that our best successes were the relationships that existed both prior to the storm and were developed during the storm, and the ability of those relationships to really leverage everything we had to bear to support the emergency response to this effort. I think that again, just to echo specifically what Cliff said about the need to be adaptive during any crises is so important, and also to maintain that initiative and to make sure that some kind of group triage can be, if not enthusiastically endorsed, at least enthusiastically executed.
Commissioner Pai.
Thanks, David, and thanks to all of the witnesses for your testimony. My first question is for Mr. Abio. You discussed in your comments some of the regulatory barriers to placing generators at cell sites. I believe you mentioned the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. I was wondering if you'd go into a little more detail as to what those regulatory obstacles were, and if there are any that also pertain to state and local regulation, getting access to areas that either we or the states or localities could help remove.
Okay, thanks for the question. So in particular, we focused on one state. We focused on Florida, and predominantly because Florida is known to have lots of power outages because of the frequency of lightning strikes. It's also very vulnerable to hurricane impacts. So we did focus a lot of our energy there, thinking that the carriers would be very interested in sharing there. As I said, didn't turn out that way, but as we looked into sizes of fuel tanks to help support multiple tenants, what we ran into is a limitation on the size of the fuel tanks. So the fuel tanks, the diesel tanks, I think the largest that we put in was 500 gallons. And for a 3-carrier service, I think that was good for about 2 days. But it really depends on what each carrier was going to draw. I think that was predominantly the one that limited us the most there. But as we were considering it, things that we had talked about were what were some of the setbacks that OSHA requires. OSHA, I think, has a 10-foot minimum setback for propane. So that was something that, as we looked at our compounds, it was going to be really hard to try to fit a generator into a central location inside of a compound and maintain that 10-foot barrier. Propane is obviously something that would be of interest, not propane, but natural gas is something that would be of interest because of the continuous feed. You wouldn't have to go and refuel, so we wouldn't be running into the fueling issues. But those were a couple of the things that I remember from our pilot program.
Great. My second question is for Mr. Merchant. The first aspect of wireless networks that you identified was backhaul. And I'm curious if you saw a distinction with respect to the performance of copper-based backhaul as opposed to fiber, and going forward, whether you think there is a role in terms of replacement of copper with fiber?
Thank you for the question. I think what I saw of the backhaul, the fiber part of the backhaul did stay up quite a bit, for sure. And this is the information that was shared to us by Verizon, who kind of owns most of the backhauls in the city. On the copper side, they did have to remove, and they're still in the process of removing a lot of the copper backhaul, as well as even the Centrex piece of the network. And I welcome the changes that a lot of these network operators are making, investing in fiber. But we also have to make sure that the public is protected, because with newer technologies, now that you see fiber being able to installed everywhere, now we are able to get voice, video, data all on the same backhaul. So at best, the public shouldn't have to pay for the upgrade. So I'll put in a plug here that it at best has to be cost neutral, or savings has to be passed on to the public. So we welcome the changes that a lot of the network providers are making in terms of investing in fiber and so on and so forth. But we also want to keep an eye on to ensure that the backhaul stays stable at the same time. The costs are not passed on to the public.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I also had a question for Mr. Schnurman. Your sixth recommendation was something I was hoping you could go into more detail about, and wrote it down quickly. But as I understand it, you said that you believe that constituent services should be hardwired within emergency communications services. And I was wondering if you could describe what you had in mind there, and if there's any role for the FCC in facilitating that. Or
Thank you for the question. Particularly for small municipalities like Long Beach, it is crucial that obviously we're not going to have a full blown out tremendous Office of Emergency Management. We don't have a huge facility, and we're not going to. We're in the process of trying to build a room with satellite phones, satellite TVs, real communications abilities. That room can't lie dormant the majority of the year. That would be an inefficiency we can't afford. So within that room also needs to be the ability to not just send out communications in a time of crisis, but also coordinate, receive phone call, not just the 911 capability, but receive 311-like phone calls, which, in a very low-tech kind of way, and route those service requests within our department so we can see real response and accountability. And so there needs to be a marriage of the constituent response, having somebody on the phone to answer your questions, particularly in a time of crisis, and the OEM equipment. We don't have the luxury of having full blown out systems, separately for all these items. We need them, in a cost-effective manner to work together. And so we'll obviously be looking for the resources immediately in order to outfit a system like that. And thank you for allowing me to highlight that.
Thank you, and I believe I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists for very thoughtful comments and specific suggestions. One of the themes, and there were several that clearly came through, was the interdependence of our communications grid and our power grid. And many of you on the panel have experience with both. Mr. Corso, let me ask you, because your work covers both pieces. What would you want the FCC to know about what will happen on the power and electric side as we think about what should happen on the communication side with respect to the power issues? I'll make it a two-part question. And what, from your experience, are the areas of greatest impact in improving the resiliency of the network, given the interdependence of the power and communications grids?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Simply put, I would say that the electric side, again, the resiliency of both systems are critical. Something we say often in New York is if you want a reliable telecommunications system, you have to have a reliable electric system. So we work in tandem in thinking through how do we make resilient the networks that are interdependent, because the interdependencies are critical. Not only within the networks as you outline in telecommunications, the wireless, the backhaul, the wireline, the VoIP, internet, all this stuff is interconnected, and you don't know where the call came from or how it got generated. All that people really care about is that it works. On the electric side, it's a little different. It's a lot more linear. But the electric system reliability and the telecommunications reliability is going to come down to investment. Capital improvements, hardening, building the networks in a more safe, more reliable way. Undergrounding is going to have to be considered. Hardening and protection from water intrusion, the kinds of things we experienced in Sandy. It's going to have to be very thoughtful prioritization and planning, because there's not enough money to go around to do all of that work instantly. It's going to have to be brought in a planning way that's going to have to be done over time, and hopefully in a coordinated way so that we can get the value of both those networks, electric and telecommunications, built in a way that's beneficial to society.
Thank you. Mr. Merchant, New York City was the first city to launch wireless emergency alerts, outbound texts to people's mobile phones in connection with emergency situations. It's still very early innings for this new technology, but I wanted to ask you whether that was a tool that you utilized in New York, and to comment in general about coming out of the Sandy experience, what opportunities you see for next generation communications technologies in addressing some of the issues we've heard this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for asking the question. We did issue 3 text messages. Our OEM folks did issue 3 text messages during, before, and after the Sandy event. I think it went well. I think sending text and wireless communication, I think it's a great way for public to kind of get ready, get informed, and be prepared for the events like this. But going back to one of my colleagues making the comments, sending out text messages, if there is nobody on the other side to listen or to receive, I think in future, as I outlined, I believe it is almost imperative that FCC, with the leadership of FCC, we come up with a protocol by which, at minimum, public should have access to some level of voice and texting capabilities so lives can be saved. In our situation, again, I'll go back. We have some homebound residents, and for them to be able to communicate with the city officials and the emergency management folks at the same time, the relatives, without having those capabilities, it would be very difficult for us to save lives. This is a question of lives and deaths. What worked in our case was we had good old-fashioned 800 megahertz radios, and we had to send people up and down the buildings. So in future, I would say having text and voice capability. Second, the generators, as we talk about, I think looking at some alternate fuel technology so that we are able to keep power up to these COs as well as cell on wheels, as well as some of the antennas. I think we have to investigate that a little bit further so that we are able to provide a longer lasting batteries. So I think that would be very helpful, and looking at those standards, and of course coordination with power as well as power utilities as well as telecom companies, providers would be very helpful.
Thank you. And I have one other area. I think what I'll do is I'll just ask for responses as follow-up to this. But one theme of the panel was the subject of information and just how important information is for preparedness, for responding during the emergency. I think it would be very helpful to hear from each of you afterwards on what concrete steps can be taken to improve the information flow. As Commissioner Rosenworcel said, what worked when it came to information? Where do you see areas for improvement with respect to information from the telecommunications providers, federal-state communication, power communications
communication. I think it's an important area, and it's something that we'd like to make an ongoing discussion with each of you.
Thank you. With that, let's wrap up. I want to thank the panelists for a very stimulating discussion, and I'd like to invite up our General Counsel, Sean Lev, who will be the moderator for the next panel. Thank you to this panel.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, honored guests and panelists. This is our second panel this morning entitled Assessing Network Resiliency, Lessons Learned from Sandy. I'm Sean Lev. I'm the General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission, and I feel compelled to say that I also was born in Brooklyn, New York. So our distinguished panels this morning. First, Assemblyman Upendra Chivukula from the New Jersey State Legislature. Jim Gerace, Vice President, State Government Affairs of Verizon, State Government Affairs for New York, Verizon. Brian Allen, Corporate Group Vice President and Chief Security Officer, Time Warner Cable. Ed Comer, General Counsel of the Edison Electric Institute. And Tony Bardo, Vice President, Hughes Network Systems, an EchoStar company. Thank you all for being here this morning. We are going to follow the same routine as in the first panel. I'm going to ask an open-ended question, give you 5 minutes to respond, one for each of you. Then we'll turn it over to the chairman and the commissioners, each to have 5 minutes of questioning as well. So if we can get started, I'll start with Assemblyman Chivukula. You bring a unique background to this endeavor. Not only are you a member of the New Jersey General Assembly, you're the chairman of the Telecommunications and Utilities Committee, vice chair of the Homeland Security and State Preparedness Committee, and a member of the Transportation, Public Works, and Independent Authorities Committee. And you're an engineer. So given your extensive background and unique perspective, we were wondering what is the one thing you would recommend, or the key things you would recommend, to ensure the continuity of communications in the likelihood of a future event like Sandy.
Thank you very much, Sean. Good morning, and thank you. I want to thank Chairman Janikowski and the members of the FCC, the commissioners. Thank you for this opportunity. I have, from New Jersey perspective, I think we had a tremendous loss of power. I think the earlier panel talked about the importance of power that goes hand in hand with the communication. When you look at Hurricane Sandy, it was an extraordinary event, and adding to the complex problems, wireless carriers were unable to rely on the critical infrastructure, including the tunnels and the subway, the steam, heat, access to fuel, and electric grid. Notwithstanding the best disaster planning, inherently unforeseen events and threats will always materialize, and plans need the flexibility and bandwidth to accommodate these unpredictable occurrences. For example, in Superstorm Sandy, significant interruptions in petroleum distribution and dispensing were not forecasted, and carriers had to adjust to the events. Disaster planning is about a process and a response structure, not adhering to some static bureaucratic rule. Consider that most significant failures against plans were the massive and prolonged electric utility outages. States can best assist in these efforts by fostering providers' efforts to quickly restore service rather than adopting burdensome, ineffective regulatory mandates. For example, in New Jersey during and after Sandy, restoring wireless service was greatly enhanced by the government and corporate cooperation through sharing critical information with providers, such as information on power availability, fuel sources, and debris cleaning. Carriers invest hundreds of millions of dollars annually to increase and improving existing sites. This investment is not motivated by any government mandate, but a business decision to offer a service that meets the demand of customers. Providers are already subject to extensive federal outage reporting requirements, so we need to have a national standard because the wireless is not a regulated industry. The state-specific outage reporting may be redundant, especially when you have a regional thing. When New York and New Jersey in the tri-state area, we had so much of disaster that took place. And also the fiercely competitive nature of the industry drives each provider to do all they can to satisfy the customers who have many choices available to them. So the ability to provide reliable service during an emergency is no exception. We need to look at some infrastructure considerations. Legislators, like myself, and regulators should support policies that expedite and streamline cell siting. I had a legislation to co-locate some of the cell sites so that way you have an opportunity for providing duplication and redundancy with the cooperation of the carriers. And then the ability to add a backup power. A lot of the times, earlier panel also talked about trying to see whether you will be able to make use of alternate sources of energy like solar and other things if we can do that. And of course, you need to look at some of the constraints in terms of the space, some of the building codes and the safety requirements. And sometimes the constraints hinder the provider's ability to maintain the coverage and expand coverage or add to the capacity. And I think we need to make sure that the future cell sites cannot just meet arbitrary backup power capacity requirements. And also in New Jersey, we have a number of legislations trying to mandate generators. I think mandating the placement of generators implicates private property rights and eminent domain considerations. It also risks unnecessary, unintended consequences. If there is a mandate to add backup power at sites incapable of housing the additional infrastructure, carriers may be forced to deactivate certain sites. Moreover, a general mandate may be inconsistent with future network deployment trends towards small cells to support ever-growing broadband usage in dense areas with challenging space and zoning constraints.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Jim Gerace. Mr. Gerace, you're responsible for Verizon's public policy, government and external affairs, regulatory matters, and philanthropy in New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut. In your role, can you describe the impact of Sandy on Verizon's network operations, including its wireline and wireless and backhaul operations, and how that affected consumers, and anything you have seen that you might try to improve in the future?
Sure. Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Commissioners, thanks for the opportunity to talk about Verizon's response to Sandy. I guess probably most appropriate to start with Lower Manhattan, since that's where we are today. And it also was a very unique challenge and issues that we had here we have never seen before. So we have two central offices that serve this part of Manhattan. Both were affected by the substantial flooding that occurred, while the switches were out of harm's way on upper floors. The real damage was done to the outside plant, the cables that go from those switches to our customers here in Lower Manhattan, and to the customers' equipment in their sub-basements. Had never seen anything like that before, but essentially today we're about 90% restored here in Lower Manhattan. This area has gone through a technological transformation that would, under ordinary conditions, take years to complete. It's only been 100 days, and we laid about 6,500 miles of fiber and removed about 150 tons of old copper cable. The result of all this is all of Lower Manhattan is now 100% fiber optic. This bodes very well for withstanding storms like this in the future. Additionally, and I like to call this the silver lining of Sandy, our customers have, the majority of which have moved their telecom equipment closets out of the basements and to floors high above where the water came in on Sandy. So I think, again, that bodes well for withstanding future storms like Sandy. A couple of other notes about outside of New York City. Obviously, we were faced with the issues that we, over the course of a year, normally face with hurricanes. in the south, and that is down trees and power lines and backhaul to cell sites. For the most part, those areas have all been restored. The wireless network fared very well during Sandy. If I was to pin it on one reason, it is because it's almost 100% fiber optic backhaul now to Verizon cell sites. The cell sites are also, we have a very high penetration of generator backup power to the cell sites, over 80%. So for the most part, the wireless network fared very well during Sandy and its aftermath. For the most part, all of the suburban areas have been restored to telephone service where customers have returned to their homes. There are still substantial amounts of the Jersey Shore and parts of Long Island, Staten Island, where people have not yet rebuilt, so there is not facilities there. But as they return, we'll be ready. For the most part, the facilities have already been run to all of those areas and just are awaiting now customers' return. Obviously, there were lessons learned in Sandy. I mentioned a couple of them, but I think the conversion to newer technologies was validated by Sandy. Where we had fiber optic cable here in Lower Manhattan, those customers were restored immediately after the switches came back up, which for our West Street CO was the next day, and our Broad Street CO was a couple days after that. Additionally, the wireless network resiliency has again validated wireless technology for use during storms like Sandy, and I think further validated its use broadly for consumers to stay in touch during these types of disasters.
Thank you. Mr. Allen, as your Time Warner Cable's Group Vice President and your Chief Security Officer, much like Verizon, Time Warner Cable has extensive operations in the region affected by Sandy. Can you please describe the impact of Sandy on your company's network operations and on your customers, and any lessons you've learned from it?
Sure. And Chairman and the Commission, thank you very much for this time. After every crisis is an opportunity to learn, and I will attest that our company, the response and recovery efforts, that everyone in the company moved with a purpose, and we're applying that same purpose to lessons learned and how we can apply this to our postmortems and our crisis response in the future. Similar to Verizon, we had some impact with our hub sites that distribute our services, and mainly with down lines. Our services were impacted as well by power outages. In preparation for Sandy, we spent a significant amount of time moving fuel pods and implementing our national fuel strategy, moving trucks and material into place to be able to repair timely, bringing in satellite phones. WPS and GETS, by the way, worked very well for us. We moved in recovery trailers, and hundreds of generators were brought in from outside the country. Our hub sites all have generators, and at times redundant generators. We brought in technicians to be able to repair generators should there be outages, and in our most critical locations, had technicians on site to repair should there be an outage with the generator. We brought in critical personnel. We brought in critical personnel to be able to help us recover with our infrastructure. At one point, we had 15 personnel stuck on one of our critical sites, and as the water was rising, so they were stuck there and committed for the time. And just an example of some of the effort that was put in. Recovery. I thought our command and control was handled very well. We had a lot of information coming in from the public to be able to respond. Refueling, we had set up 6 refueling stations across the 5 boroughs and outside of the city. some of the main issues that we had dealt with in our recovery was prioritization and moving fuel around to our generators. When you have 200 plus generators out in the field that need to be refueled on a timely basis, the logistics around that are significant, and moving around the city was difficult. We had significant assistance with the Office of Emergency Management in New York City, where we had a seat at the table. The NCC was incredibly helpful. I think one of the issues that we deal with on a regular basis is trying to get the emergency management offices across the country to recognize that the cable operators also provide very similar services to the phone providers and essential services. And that's been a challenge of ours at times. We've spent a lot of time trying to build these relationships. John O'Connor, Mike Roskin from the NCC have been incredible partners for ours. The New York City OEM was incredibly helpful to be able to respond. And we talk about crisis, and I've always said that we have plans, and we have significant plans for hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes. But when plans work, it's business as usual. When plans don't work, you've got a crisis. And we certainly dealt with a crisis, and it's the adaptation that everyone talked about, and being able to adapt and respond and having that timely communication was helpful. Being able to communicate with the power authorities is critical for us. I know they dealt with a very similar crisis, and we sat next to them at the OEM, and they were bombarded with requests for information. Having that kind of information is incredibly timely. It enables us to prioritize and focus our recovery efforts. So that we're not wasting resources in locations that power may not come up after a certain amount of time. And as resilient as our plant is, when there are major power outages and commercial power is out, we really are dependent on them and to work closely with them, especially as they recover, that they don't do damage to fiber lines. So we did work closely with them, and the New York City OEM was incredibly helpful as well as the NCC. But it's an incredible relationship that needs to be established at a level that's not just doesn't happen during crisis. It's pre-established. The information is timely and it's accurate. I mean, we certainly understand the amount of issues that they dealt with as well, sitting in the OEM. And I think that's it's hard to adapt on the move like that. It really does need to be established. One of the lessons learned that was critical for us is the relationships with OEM on the federal level was really critical. And when we go into, at times where we have access issues, the majority of access issues that we have where local people at roadblocks saying, all right, well, you can go in and fix your phone and broadband, but don't touch your video, not knowing it's the same plant and how the plant really services a lot of other services as well. So it's an information and it's education, and we spend a lot of time on that. But that was a big lesson learned for us as well.
Thank you. So we'll turn next to Ed Comer, who is the Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary at the Edison Electric Institute. Mr. Comer, a key theme this morning has been the interdependency between communications networks and the electric grid. Can you please describe briefly how the electric utilities responded to these events and how that response might be modified in the future to coordinate better with communications companies?
Thank you. This is one of many proceedings, both formal and informal, where our industry is, looking over lessons learned from Hurricane Sandy. We lost 10 million customers in 20 states. That was twice the number of customers that we lost in Hurricane Katrina, and we lost 95% of our customers in Long Island. I think it's fair to say the interdependencies are obvious. We rely upon telecom systems to operate our systems, to manage our restoration and coordination, and to communicate with our customers real time in emergencies, as well as communicating with all the emergency response people that we've talked about. Resiliency is an issue for us as well. It's a complicated subject. At minimum, it means be prepared, have multiple backups. It's certainly for emergency response facilities, it's important to have adequate backups. I would commend you to take a close look at a DOE report that was issued in October 2010, talking about telecom requirements in the smart grid context. I think it has some excellent recommendations about backup requirements for telecom in terms of our needs. And I will say that many of our members, we are subject to federally approved reliability standards for our industry. And it's a complicated process, but that includes backup requirements and other things. And many of our members use our own private telecom facilities because they believe that they want longer backups than they can get from the commercial system. We are, notwithstanding the storms and the outages, subject to extraordinary reliability requirements, and they're requirements we want to meet. Briefly on recovery, one of the things that's unique about our industry is that we have a voluntary mutual assistance program for hurricanes, ice storms, Sandy, etc. Through this program, it's been in existence a long time. We brought tens of thousands of workers from as far as the West Coast and Hawaii and from Canada into the East Coast to help respond. We did our planning ahead of time. We started phone calls with our CEOs of all of our member companies a couple of days before landfall. Secretary Chu, Secretary of Energy Chu, attended those phone calls. And after landfall, on October 30th, President Obama joined the call and urged us to restore power as quickly as possible, promised to do everything he could to eliminate any federal regulatory barriers, and they were very helpful. And FEMA Administrator Fugate invited representatives from our industry into the FEMA headquarters in Washington. First time that's ever happened, they let an outsider in. And I will say that, those calls and contacts continued for 2 weeks. And to echo the comments you heard earlier from the state and local people and the FEMA people, it was very helpful in coordinating and expediting a lot of activities at the federal level. Again, throughout that period, we sent tens of thousands of workers to the New York and New Jersey area primarily. Many of them came after they had restored power in their home areas. We too learned more about fuel issues, and we had some responders who brought their own fuel from the south. We had others brought them in from Ohio, and some of the locals here did have problems. And certainly I know from listening to Secretary of Energy Chu, fuel is going to be a bigger priority for all of us. In terms of coordinating response more directly between telecom providers and utilities, I think it's important that that has to be done in coordination with FEMA through the federal system, because we worked with DOE because that was our line agency under the federal system. It wasn't FERC, which is our analogy, but we worked with DOE. And most of the direct response activities are managed at the state and local level. It's important to do the coordination there. And for us, it's important to keep the state public utility commissions involved because they have a lot to say about our priorities and and how the recovery system has run itself.
Thank you. Finally, Tony Bardo is Vice President at Hughes Network Systems. Mr. Bardo, the role of less traditional or gap-filling communications capabilities during emergency situations is an important part of network resiliency. Can you describe the role satellite providers played in the Sandy response and what it should be in the future?
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. I thought you'd never ask. Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, thank you for the opportunity. Satellite technology represents the only high-speed broadband connectivity option available everywhere across the United States. And today, satellite technology and the satellite industry delivers broadband on a cost-effective basis to over 1 million subscribers that are otherwise unserved or underserved by terrestrial or wireless technologies. Satellite can also serve as an instrumental communications path in times of emergency in the immediate aftermath. Satellite coverage is uniformly high quality and offers a truly alternate path-diverse communications path, which is essential for emergency response and recovery activities when disaster strikes and terrestrial broadband networks are most vulnerable. Weeks after Superstorm Sandy pummeled the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, many thousands of people and businesses were still without power. And so were many base stations, towers, and switching centers of terrestrial network providers that were knocked out in the wake of the storm. Conversely, satellite technology weathered the storm pretty well, with limited or no disruptions to service. And Hughes played and continues to play, even now, a vital role in keeping emergency responders and business and people connected in the aftermath. And here's a couple of ways we did that. The Rockaway and Far Rockaway areas of Queens, New York, homes to between 175 and 200,000 people, were hit particularly hard during the storm and had little or no communications. Among the great things that FEMA did, we started working with FEMA months ago, started preparing for such an event in terms of having satellite terminals, 100 satellite terminals and Wi-Fi stations that we provide, pre-staged and a first right of refusal established for FEMA for such an event. FEMA opened up about 40 disaster recovery centers, or DRCs, in the area, providing much needed information about recovery services such as housing, rental assistance, claims for citizens, and assisting other agencies such as the VA and the SSA and the Small Business Administrations. Communications are an essential part of a DRC, but with terrestrial lines down, volunteers and disaster victims couldn't make calls or apply for services. Hughes responded within 48 hours, as were the terms of our pre-established program with FEMA, and provided the DRCs with broadband terminals and high-speed broadband service. Secondly, we helped out the Habitat for Humanity in Breezy Point area of New York. About over 100 homes were destroyed, and the Habitat set up a command center nearby to coordinate the rebuilding efforts. We worked with the Global VSAT Forum and Cisco to establish satellite communications capability so that the organization could continue their rebuilding efforts. And finally, a really low-tech way that we helped out an organization called the All Hazards Consortium. They work with state, local, federal government agencies. Hughes has thousands of retail customers, hotels, restaurants, gas stations, convenience stores, pharmacies up and down the affected area. And they are our customers. We provided the All Hazards Consortium with a simple spreadsheet regularly. It was every day at 1 o'clock we provided this to. And it provided truckers, first responders, people that needed to know where they could get a bed, where they could get gas, where they could get a meal, simply because of the simple spreadsheet that we provided every day to the All Hazards Consortium. They distributed it, of course, to FEMA, to elements of DHS, and to state and local government. So this was very helpful. So we were honored really to have a role to work with the community. Again, out of the 40 DRCs, we had to establish immediate service, and FEMA, of course, had to wait, as per Sean's earlier comments, that FEMA had to wait for the states to invoke them, and we had to wait for then FEMA to invoke us, and then we got to it right away. And the satellite industry, Hughes, of course, I work for Hughes, but the satellite industry, it's all our hallmark to help in the immediate aftermath recovery effort. But I dare say that one of the things that we are trying to advocate for, and I should have done a better job with Mr. Schneerman of Long Beach. I've got a lot of work to do in terms of outreach to let him know we're there. But the idea of preparedness, establish preparedness at governmental centers, at town halls, at federal agencies that deal and work with the public. Many federal agencies say, okay, well, here we've got services from Carrier A and Carrier B. And while I'm an Italian American and I appreciate the hand movement and so forth, I'm saying, no, you got Carrier A and Carrier B going down the same path. And so path diversity is so important here. And if there's a message I want to leave with the audience and with you folks, it's that's a very useful process to invoke in the building of network architectures.
Thank you. All right. We'll turn now to the commissioners. I believe we'll start again with Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you, Mr. Bardo. It's good to know that we have some things in common. You know them. So you made mention and reinforced that how important a role that Hughes, the company that you play when it comes to temporary services, especially on cases of emergency. And we heard earlier about some of the, while well-meaning, some of the challenges, some rules and regs have in terms of springing into action in times of crisis. Can you tell me what the FCC could do more about, or how we can better that engagement in terms of you deploying your network services during emergencies?
Thank you for that. I think that the FCC could encourage the best practices of what went right. Commissioner Rosenworcel made mention in the last panel of stressing the things that went right. What went right was that satellite was invoked, perhaps not enough, perhaps not quick enough, but this whole idea of preparedness. There's an issue of emergency preparedness and emergency response. Emergency response, you're still going to have that 2 or 3 days lag time before we can get our installers, and we have installers nationwide, and they can perform miracles, but you still have that 2 or 3 days lag time where people are without comms. That is kind of critical. Preparedness, path diversity, encourage all government at all 3 levels to where funds are available or where funds could be made available to employ path diversity in the networks. We're not here to say that we're the answer to everybody's problems. Everybody's got a role here. There's a great many strengths just here at this table of wireline, radio, cell, and satellite. We all can form a role here, and that mixture, I think, is the key.
And this would be for the entire panel, given the time constraints. It was alluded to, but I think many of us are aware that your employees really put themselves oftentimes in great peril during this, particularly this last crisis and any crisis. Can you tell me what we could do more about ensuring their safety, and what lessons have we learned in that exchange? With all of that. And how can we help, again? How can state, federal, and local governments help with that?
Yeah, I'll take this quick. It's on this time, so that's a good thing. Again, the information sharing, and I'll just share a quote. Dwight Eisenhower says, "In preparing for battle, plans are useless, but planning is invaluable." And that was proved so true during this crisis. We do a tremendous amount of efforts in preparing and doing risk assessments and business impact analysis. It's the information sharing and the acknowledgement of that these services are essential, which I know it resonated very much so with our employees. And you see how communications are being adapted into communities and the economy, and that really drove the purpose. And being able to share that and helping us adapt during crisis, because we've got the dedicated people and we've got the mindset and the experts in the field. It's when the plans aren't working and being able to know who to reach out to and getting to the right folks at a federal level and at a very local level. And if we do that, I think the recovery efforts are going to be a lot more effective and a lot more efficient. I think we did a great job. And because it was a massive crisis. But that's the one area that I think that we can respond even better and even quicker and need to adapt across the board.
Not an unrelated question, but Mr. Comer mentioned something that I've grown accustomed to, well, at least in my role former role as a state regulator, in that there is this sharing that happens all hands on when in times of crisis, particularly on the energy side. I'm wondering on the cable and other essential services side, and when we say cable, you can debate whether that's essential, but a lot of yours, oh no, I said that out loud. But what I mean by that is in terms of your businesses, it is communications. You've got telephony in the mix. So tell me, given all of that, are there any duplicates or replication as it relates to the energy model of sharing and coming together in times of crisis? Did anybody help you when the chips were down?
Yes, actually, I'll put your last two questions together on that one. Thanks for acknowledging, first of all, the importance of employee safety. And one of the best practices, I think, that came out of Sandy in our work with the electric utilities is previously standard operating procedure would be the electric company has to clear the way first before the telephone company could come in and then restore their service. Because of the sheer magnitude of the damage, particularly in New Jersey, the electric crews just couldn't keep up, and we obviously were slowed down because they couldn't get to everywhere. So they, with our help, developed kind of it was almost a mapping type of a software that allowed us to see where they had turned power off, so we could go into that area even though there was no electric crew in sight. And in those cases, we could put electric poles back. In cases where they would go to an area where our poles were down, they would replace our poles. So there was a cooperative agreement there that we had with both the electric utilities in New Jersey that I think really went a long way to speeding the restoral of both electric and telephone service in New Jersey.
Thank you. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Mr. Allen said something about out of crisis comes opportunity. And like you, I'm a big believer in that. So I think it's instructive to look back to one of our last crises in Hurricane Katrina and look at what adjustments were made to the laws that govern communications and disaster recovery. After Hurricane Katrina, we updated the Stafford Act in some small ways. The Stafford Act, of course, is the law that governs disaster assistance from the federal level after the big storm or incident. We also made some adjustments at the FCC and attempted to put in place some backup power rules for wireless cell towers, which were later disallowed. But in any event, if I were to make you all legislators for the day, except our friend from New Jersey, who already is one, I'd ask you, what laws or rules would you change so that things work better next time?
Let me just say, from my perspective, it's not necessarily laws and rules. There are lots of things one could do with the Stafford Act, but the relationships are really important. And I echo that we've heard in several contexts, because it's the working together and the relationships and even in the comment about how the restoration worked when the power got shut off. All of that's really critical, and you can do a lot of that within the framework of the existing system, and understanding that we do have mutual interdependencies and are reliant upon each other really goes a long way to getting things done. And you have to establish those relationships ahead of time. We work very closely with state and local people, and should be working with telecom people at the state and local level to help know how to do and get those things done.
I'll take a point, elaborate on a point I made earlier. One of the chairman's stated goals for these hearings was to figure out how to prevent these outages. Well, you can't prevent the disasters, of course, but I'll get back to the part of continuity of operations, continuity of government, preparedness, and so forth. And I think if I were king for a day, I'd look at the agencies of government, again at all three levels, and here's I'll get to the reason for making the point, is to ensure that they have the funding and the guidance, technical guidance and so forth, to establish path diversity and resiliency, which was the title of this panel, in their agency networks. Why is that? Well, during a disaster, it's when citizens need their government the most. And if the doors are closed because their comms are out, where are we? So, just that very one simple point, I'd make that decision and go back to my day job.
Without pointing to any specific laws or regulations, I think generally we brought in a lot of resources from outside, and there are a lot of licensing issues with fuel providers and contractors, because the impact of the storm was so massive that relying on vendors and third parties locally was difficult. So we did have to bring in security. Our generators were being stolen, and there are licensing issues and fuel, and there are licensing issues to try to find the fuel providers who could provide fuel into the city. So that was a little bit problematic and something to look at, and certainly any restrictions to be able to share information that would be relevant for recovery efforts.
I'm already a legislator, but I give you a couple of ideas. One of the things you need to think about when a disaster occurs and you want to come up with disaster recovery plans, I think there should be a mechanism to turn off some of the local zoning laws, because when you require the carriers to bring emergency generation, and there are laws that are prohibiting that, and so that one definitely you need to look at. The second thing you need to think about is this cell tower siting, because we shouldn't be building so many cell towers all over the place. We should figure out a way to co-locate some of the antennas, and also the cooperation that took place between AT&T, T-Mobile during Katrina, that they were able to use their switching facilities. So you should encourage when there is a disaster recovery is taking place, you should allow more cooperation. I think the loss of collusion and all that, but I think you need to figure out a way how to create that redundancy and duplication, so that way you are able to, the towers that are not down, they can, if you have the duplication, then you should be able to use the alternate carrier to be able to send the signals. I think that would help a lot.
I'm sorry.
No, go.
Oh, okay. Quick question, and we'll start with you. New York and New Jersey are unique. The population is so dense. The buildings are so tall, they reach the sky. So I'm wondering if there are any real estate or landlord issues that come up with disaster recovery, making sure you get access to your equipment, making sure the equipment is placed in locations it's safe. Anything on that front that we should be thinking of?
I don't think there was anything that we couldn't overcome quickly. To your previous question, there's always a little things that may be a nuisance, like payroll taxes for workers coming from out of state, fuel that we can't import to the state because you just are not allowed to bring it over the border. That sort of thing got in the way. But I will say that during Sandy, we didn't let any of that stuff slow us down, and was always overcome. For specific landlord issues, there's always some you can't find when you need to find them during a crisis like this, those sorts of things. But for the most part, we got our equipment where it had to go.
Unless anyone else wants to answer that question, we'll go to Commissioner Pai.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks again to the witnesses for their testimony. My first question would be for Mr. Grace. You suggested several times throughout your testimony that Verizon had replaced a lot of the aging copper plant with fiber, and that had a lot of advantages for the network. I was wondering if you could expound in a little more detail as to the physical characteristics of fiber that make it more resilient and easier to restore compared to some of the legacy copper.
There's a lot of advantages, starting with it's made out of glass versus metal, so it's not susceptible to really salt water, which is what really devastated the cables here in Lower Manhattan. We made the decision really quickly to pull all of that copper plant out of the street, because even if we were able to restore it, it would fail over time because of the corrosive nature of salt water. We did not see that at all with the fiber that we have in the same streets. In fact, very resilient, lit right back up when the switches came back. And I think for the long term, it's absolutely the way to go. The other thing that it doesn't get a lot of play is it's not brittle like copper. So just from wind, where it's an aerial fiber, does not break as often as copper. So it has advantages there, not just being buried under the street. So we're very confident that the networks that we've rebuilt over the last 100 days will be much better off for the future storms.
Terrific. Thanks. If I could follow up on a comment that Assemblyman Chivukula made in your opening remarks, you talked about some of the legal and policy issues that you saw were implicated with a mandate, either from the FCC or from somebody else, with respect to backup power. I was wondering if you could discuss in a little more detail some of the issues you talked about. You mentioned briefly, for example, eminent domain and zoning. Could you go into some more detail on some of that?
Thank you, Commissioner. I think what I heard, I mean, I don't operate the business, so I hear from the carriers. So, well, New York City, for example, when they needed they required to have backup generation, and the zoning laws do not allow them to just emergency basis. You can come up with emergency generation. That is one of the things, and I think that power is the critical thing. If you can have power, you can have a lot of the other things, and also, if you are mandating some of the laws saying that every site, cell site, should have emergency power, then you have to make sure that that site has the enough space to have that kind of equipment and space for the equipment, and so that way you're not violating some of the local laws. I think that's the major thing. This is where the federal government has to work with the local government, because a state like New Jersey is a home rule state, and a lot of the laws are, everything has to go before the zoning board. And I have sat through some of the zoning, not as a member, but as a public, I listen to it. It goes into the early morning hours, and people say why they don't want the cell tower to be sited. But same people are looking for cell phone coverage. They say, how come I have a dead zone? Why cannot have coverage? And so I think this is where a lot of the education, I think FCC, instead of saying that you can go ahead and put the towers wherever you want for the carriers, but you need to educate the public. I mean, without the towers, you are not going to have the signal. And if you don't have the signal, you don't have the coverage. I think that's what the thing. Another thing you need to think about also, I don't know whether it's already existing, some kind of a geographical information system that can come up with all the sites, and then you will be able to work with the carriers, foster some cooperation between the carriers in terms of co-location and providing redundancy.
Terrific, thanks. And Mr. Comer, you discussed some of the issues involved in coordination with some of your partners on the communications side. I believe you said that it would be difficult, or if not impossible, to coordinate with them unless you went through FEMA. Is that correct? And if so, why?
What I said is I think that coordination has to be done at many levels. Okay. Certainly at the federal level, FEMA. I know all the things we've heard here about fuel issues. We heard DOE was dealing with them at the federal level. They heard it from a number of people. We certainly had those issues, but I think in terms of the specific restoration issues, it's really a state and local issue. I mean, it's not it involves municipalities, police forces, and it gets down to the state and local issue. So they're all important in coordination, and the informal coordination is important too.
Absolutely. If I could follow up very quickly, we had a very interesting discussion, you and I, before the panel started, in which you said that consumer expectations now are actually higher with respect to power, precisely because we have some of the technological advancements in terms of apps that show you where power is out in certain areas. I was wondering if you could just elucidate that point for the
yeah, let me make that point. We have noticed since Katrina, our companies down there indicated customers were 5 days was sort of where they lost patience. There was a recent storm down there just this past year, and they said that's down to about 3 days. And our experience, and it is in large part because everybody relies on electricity and telecom, is people talk to each other, electronically, smartphones and all of that. They're very dependent on it, and their patience is lower. We try to respond real time. Most utilities have the kind of maps that I think Jim was talking about that will show outages and try to communicate electronically to our customers to keep them informed. But we are living in much more of a real-time world. Thanks to everybody here for the blessings and the problems of that. But it has affected our customer interactions.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Janikowski.
Thank you. Mr. Gerace, I had a chance, as you know, to visit your facilities right near here, the backhaul facilities, the central office, and the devastation really was just incredible. Hard to believe. 3 or 4 floors of equipment completely covered by water for a couple of days, and it's when you see it, it's hard to believe you were able to provide any service at all. And I also had a chance to meet a number of people who had been working around the clock for several days, away from their families, going out in the field, risking their lives, and that's true for a number of these different companies, and so I think we all commend that. I did want to ask you to respond to some of the points we heard on the first panel. We heard from the city manager of Long Beach and the representative from New York City that while their communications facilities were up and running, they could communicate with each other, they couldn't reach their constituents. They couldn't reach consumers. They were not satisfied at all with the level of service and the level of outages during the storm and after for a period of time. And we also heard that they had issues knowing who to reach at Verizon and coordinating on recovery and in general not having good enough information, good enough visibility about what was going on. And so I wanted to ask you for your response to that.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. As far as the communication issue between the town and Verizon, I really don't understand what happened there because we did have an account manager on that who was talking to the town. So maybe that didn't filter up to Mr. Schnurman. But I will tell you that we had 2 cow equivalents in their town within 5 days. And the only reason it took 5 days was access to that area, getting passable streets, that sort of thing. So 1 full cow and then a repeater system was installed in Long Beach on the 5th and the 6th of November. So now, by the way, we knew even before we talked to the town, because we know what cell sites are out, that they needed something to augment the signal out there. We knew about the devastation. So even before we had contact with the town, we were moving resources towards there. That it couldn't get there quicker, I don't think is anyone's fault. We would have liked to have had it up the day after the storm, but it just wasn't possible.
Power. The interdependence of the communications grid and the electric grid was a big subject of the first panel. It's come up here. Let me ask you this, but also a representative from Time Warner Cable and others on the panel. What do you need from our electric grid to provide the level of communications service for people and businesses in connection with Sandy and storms like that?
Yeah, I think it's just timely information, because we're ready to respond, and we need to focus our resources, and that's the biggest issue. And our colleague in the OEM was overwhelmed with requests, and we recognize that, but it would be incredibly helpful. So it's primarily information, and us being able to get that information timely and accurate information, and we'll be ready to respond.
Let me press on that a little bit. What do you need to know about what the duration of power outages is likely to be during storms? I assume your preparedness is different if you're assuming a day of power outage versus a week. And how can you plan the redundancy and resiliency and backup that you need without visibility into what our power grid will provide?
Yeah, so our efforts in responding are independent, but they are essential, right, to have that coordination. So our efforts to respond are, looking at potential impacts to what's coming with the storm or any crisis for that matter. The benefits to be able to coordinate with the power companies are we do have limited resources on where they're coming in and as we're bringing in and the amount of impact that's happening. So if we understand where recovery efforts are going to be prioritized or where they're not going to be able to prioritize, it'll help us focus. So I think it's one, timeliness of the information to know where we can prioritize. But two, it also allows us to be able to better communicate to our customer base on expected recovery times. And we are in places where we are providing recovery efforts where the power companies aren't, like Verizon was doing. We do have to be careful, obviously, with down power lines to make sure that we're coordinated. Another thing that's critical, too, is as they recover, the power authorities recover from crisis, at times we see significant damage to our fiber lines when they're recovering, as they're taking trees down. So being able to work side by side with them to help identify what are critical lines, what are critical fiber lines for us would be very helpful and would minimize outage moving forward. There are times that we see even more damage post-crisis.
Mr. Comer, let me ask you, we've heard consistently, and we all know this as consumers and businesses, that communications is essential to our everyday lives, to communicating with family and businesses, and particularly essential during emergencies. And we're all very clearly aware now that our communications grid relies on our power grid. What should communications providers assume about what will happen in disasters with our power grid? Will we see a response to Sandy so that the communications companies can say, well, that's not going to happen again? Or do the communications companies have to build into their planning an assumption that the kinds of outages that we've seen in Sandy and in derecho and in other events are a part of the landscape, and given the importance of communications, they have to assume that what has happened will continue and prepare for that?
I think that everybody has to assume that bad things happen, and you have to be prepared for that. And, we always have different kinds of storms. Sandy was a particularly bad storm. It was a very bad storm. We've seen a number of bad storms lately. But you never know when they're going to happen or where they're going to happen, but you have to be prepared ahead of time, with, advanced planning, planning to coordinate. You have to have, reasonable amount of backup, assuming, you never know quite what the worst case is, but you have to be prepared for that. Just as we have to, and we don't know ahead of time any more than anybody else when the storm is going to hit or exactly what kind of impact it's going to have or what it's going to put out. So you have to, both as we heard earlier, be prepared and, have your system as resilient and as strong as you can afford to do so. And our affordability is constrained by our what our PUCs are willing to approve. You have to be prepared to do that. You have to be prepared to have, reasonable opportunities to, bring in a recovery team and have what we heard earlier, the flexibility to respond to the situation on the ground once you determine what it is. Each situation is unique. And when people say, everybody asks us, well, when are you going to recover? When is, person A or business A or B going to get power? We have priorities that are related to health and safety, primarily. But we don't have the flexibility to control the electric system with the precision that the telecom system works. And most priorities for recovery are determined once we know where the damage was and what was damaged. And the priorities are to try to bring up the most amount of people you can at the quickest amount of time, at the least effort. That tends to be your transformers and those kinds of stations and your main feeder lines. And the lowest priorities are one or two people out at the end of a wire. You learn things through the process. We've been implementing smart grid, and the administration's been very helpful about that. About a third of the nation now has smart meters. That again is a telecom-dependent system. It gives us much better real-time information. It's helped us expedite recovery. In the south, in Alabama, there were some tornadoes. Went through, and our member of the Southern Company, which had smart grid meters in Tuscaloosa, could immediately track the area of the damage by just seeing where the meters were out. Now, you're all used to that in the telecom system, but that's new for us. But it really helps. And, we're trying to get better all the time to give people information about, recovery. You do the best you can.
Well, thank you. I think our time is out on this, but
Chairman, if I may, I just want
please.
One of the I held a number of hearings on the power with the power companies and end customers. One of the things that strikes me is that the outage systems, there are different systems like SCADA and different systems are feeding that information in. They're not really able to integrate that information to provide that is consumer friendly, that you are able to get that information. So that information has to be communicated with the carriers, the communication companies. And so that's what we need to focus on, some of the outage reporting and collecting the data, integrating the data that is usable.
Thank you. Well, this is an ongoing, serious process that we're engaged in, and we very much appreciate each of you coming, sharing your thoughts, responding to questions, and we'll continue to appreciate that because we'll need your ongoing engagement in order to determine what the lessons are from Sandy and what the smartest things that all of us in our roles can do to prepare for the future and avoid the kinds of outages that we saw in Sandy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.